Okay, let's say you've applied all the preventive strategies that we've covered in Confident Classroom Management, and you've tried all those key responses that we've covered to deal with behaviour and change behaviour in the moment when it occurs. But none of it works, because there are always going to be those instances when students still ignore your instructions and they still don't do as you say. What if you've used a strategy to get their attention and it's still not working? What do we do then? Well, that's when consequences come into play. And consequences are so powerful when they're done right that they can literally stop behaviour in the moment. But the key is that they've got to be done right. They put an end to the power struggles, the backwards and forwards between you and the students. You know, when you give them an instruction and they ignore you or they answer back, and then you have to repeat the instruction and it goes backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and drives everyone mad. Consequences have the power to put an end to those power struggles, and they do that because they give students a choice. They give them a choice in outcome, and by giving them that critical choice in what happens next, we give them the responsibility and accountability. We start getting them to think about their behaviour, and that's when behaviour management really starts to take form and take shape. That's when things really start to happen. When your students aren't just relying on being told, they're actually starting to think about outcomes and think about consequences. Now, the effectiveness of consequences depends almost entirely on how they're used and applied. A weak teacher uses consequences ineffectively because they're fearful of giving their students an ultimatum. They care deeply about the students. They want them to succeed. So they don't want to come across as unfriendly or negative or nasty in any way, shape or form. So they're reluctant to give them this final harsh boundary. And so there's a lot of indecisiveness, there's a lot of questioning, there's a lot of pleading. And the students get lots of second chances and third chances and fourth chances, and it just goes on and on and on. And they know, those students know, that the teacher isn't really in control. The weak teacher, when trying to use consequences, gives control to the kids. A punitive teacher, on the other hand, uses consequences in a way that generates hostility. There tends to be a lot of shouting, and the punishments they use tend to be over the top, because they're coming from a position of being desperate to be in control. Often they get very frustrated when that control is taken away from them, so they start raising their voice and they start giving punishments that are way over the top, and they can often come across as being unfair. Now, they may well get control in the classroom, but a lot of the time it's a constant battle because the students deep down resent them. You can't really get your best out of someone when you're ruling through fear. And these teachers, hostile teachers, are often so desperate to be in control that they get drawn in to those secondary behaviours. You know, when you give a student a consequence and then they start rolling their eyes or muttering under the breath, and that's when some teachers get drawn in. What did you say? What did you say to me? And then the battle continues. So that's ineffective use of consequences. Okay, so how might that look in the classroom? Well, the weak teacher, there's going to be a lot of, Johnny, I keep telling you, will you please be quiet when I'm talking? Johnny, I've warned you, I'm going to warn you again, I'm not having this. When I'm talking, you stop talking. Johnny, how many times do I have to tell you? Johnny, don't you think you should be quiet now? Johnny, this is getting beyond a joke. I'll tell you what, Johnny, this is it, the last time. This is the last time I'm saying this to you, Johnny. Johnny, I'm not telling you again. I'm going to call home. That's it. This is the last time. If it happens again, I'm going to write a letter to your mum. Johnny, will you pack it in? Please, look, what else do I have to do? Come on, Johnny. It goes on and on and on because Johnny knows that you're not serious. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of idle threats. The teacher isn't in control. The hostile teacher might do it something like this. Pack it in. I'm sick of hearing your voice. Get in the corridor now. You what? Right, you've just won yourself a detention as well as time in the corridor. Now move! What? 2 detention! You're in detention all week, lad. Now get out! That teacher isn't in control at all. And although some kids in that classroom are going to keep their heads down, it's going to be that classic case of reluctant compliance. You cannot get your best from your students if you treat them like that. Okay, let's look at a better way to deliver consequences. But before we do that, we'll look at the factors which go to making up an effective consequence. Okay, so effective consequences must have, first of all, a warning. Now I know there are some behaviours that shouldn't have a warning. You should have an immediate consequence for things like vandalism and violence and abuse. Those things, you go straight into a consequence. But for low-level behaviour, which is what we're talking about here, things like constant talking throughout the lesson, we need to have a warning in place, because it's that warning which gives students the opportunity to make a choice in terms of outcome, in terms of what happens next. And that choice is that vital time where they take responsibility for their behaviour. Suddenly they're accountable. It's their choice what happens next. That's why a warning is so crucial. Next, your consequences need to be stepped. And by that I mean you need a hierarchy, set levels of consequence, and always somewhere else to go. When I first started teaching, I was at Teacher Training College, and I was given a lively group of Year 10s. Okay, so these were 14, 15-year-old students. They weren't particularly bad behaved at all. It was a good school. They were just a lively group. And I was told that if behaviour got out of hand, if I struggled at any time, I could send a student out to the head teacher's office. Now, basically, that's what I used as my consequence for every single behaviour. I went from 0, where there's me talking normally like this and delivering the lesson, to shouting my head off and sending them out into the corridor to the head teacher's office in one jump. I had nothing in between. So whether they were throwing stuff around, or just talking when I was talking, or getting up out of their seats, or full-on fighting, it was exactly the same consequence. Get out! Go and see the head teacher! So the head teacher would come to me after the lesson and say, what are you playing at? You can't send kids out all the time like this. You need to have stepped consequences in place. You need somewhere else to go. Because if I'm shouting at the top of my voice and I've used my ultimate consequence, which is sending them out to the head teacher's office, where else do I go? What else is left? I've got nowhere else, nothing higher if that behaviour escalates, or if they ignore me, or if they answer me back. I can just repeat exactly the same again. I said get out, get yourself to the head teacher's office. And if they ignore me again, what do? So if you go in with your big guns first, you're setting yourself up to fail. You're setting yourself up for ridicule. Those kids thought I was a laughing stock, because there were kids who ignored me and answered back. And I just had the same response every time, shouting at the top of my voice, get out. Stepped consequences mean you start with something small, and you've always got something up your sleeve ready to escalate should the behaviour warrant it. Next, your consequences need to be a logical follow-up to the behaviour you're targeting. And by that I mean, if you don't pay your electricity bill, your electricity gets cut off. They don't cut your gas off, they don't take away your television or take away your car, they cut your electric off, because that's the logical follow-up. If you don't pay your electric bill, you lose your electricity supply. And it should be the same with the behaviours that we're targeting. So if you've got 2 students messing around at the back, the logical follow-up would be to split them up and separate them and give them some time apart. And if they behave well apart, then they get the opportunity to move back together. If they're swinging around on chairs, then the logical follow-up would be to limit the amount of time they spend on a chair. You might want to get them standing up, take the chair away and say, when you can behave properly, you can have your chair back. Perhaps you wouldn't want to be quite that extreme. If they're drawing on the desks, the logical follow-up would be to come back and spend some time cleaning the desks. If they're wasting your time, if they're wasting lesson time and they're constantly talking, the logical follow-up would be to take some of their time. So that's when they'd be coming back to work during break times, lunch times, or even after school. The consequence, if it logically follows up the behaviour it's targeting, there's less chance that the students will see it as being an unfair punishment. So we're steering clear of being the punitive teacher. And finally, they need to be delivered with care. Consequences, if they're used correctly, are a fantastic opportunity to actually bond with your students. When you do this right, your students really start to respect you. That's when your reputation starts to spread as a leader, as a real classroom manager, somebody who's fair with the students but very, very firm. If you get tied into those secondary behaviours, if you get caught up with those and you lose your temper, then you're going to lose face with the students. If you scream at the students when you're delivering your consequences and you give the overtop punishments, then you're going to lose respect with your students. By delivering them with care, we're talking about being respectful to the students and showing that you actually care about them. If you keep that in mind, it's difficult to lose your temper. It's difficult to, or perhaps not as easy to lose your temper and not as easy to lose control. And finally with that, I would say, bear in mind to let the consequence do the work for you. There's no need to lose your temper. There's no need to go screaming and scolding and threatening, because the consequence, if it's used effectively, if it's planned effectively, it will do the work for you. You just need to calmly state what's going to happen and give them the choice.